Well, good evening. It is Thursday of Holy Week. And so as we have been journeying through Holy Week together, we've looked at each of the individual days and we've looked at the events and the controversy and the teaching that's happened on those days that's culminating in tomorrow's event, which will be Good Friday, where Jesus goes to the cross, and then also Easter Sunday morning, the morning of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so here we are on Thursday in the life and time of Jesus. It is April the 2nd, AD 33. And there are a lot of scriptures here that pertain to Thursday of Holy Week. In fact, a good bit of the Gospel of John is contained here in Holy Week, starting in John chapter 13, where he washes the disciples' feet, which we'll get to here in a moment. So we come to Thursday of Holy Week, and it's a day of Holy Week that a lot of churches, depending on your tradition or background, calls Maundy Thursday, and it's Passover week. So again, Passover is extremely important, and it's coming nearer and nearer towards the end of the week. And so as Passover approaches, Jesus tells the disciples to go get an appropriate lamb, one without spot or blemish, and to go and meet him and gather with him in an upper room, so in the city of Jerusalem, and so they could celebrate the Passover supper together. And later that evening, after they are done with their meal and with Jesus' teachings, Jesus will later be arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and so will begin the Jewish trials of Jesus. So as we explore this day, we could ask a few questions. Was it significant that Jesus' last week took place at Passover? What is the relationship between the Last Supper and the Passover meal? And why could the Jewish leaders not handle Jesus on their own? Why did they eventually go to Pontius Pilate and have him tried and then be crucified? So the celebration of Passover was one of the great moments on the Jewish calendar. It's a great festival. And what Passover is the celebration of Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. When God brought them out, He led them across the Red Sea. They go out into the wilderness, and they're on this journey of going to their own land. And it's important that during Passover week that you would be in Jerusalem. And it's because only in Jerusalem is there a temple. And only at the temple could you buy or could you get a Passover lamb and have it slain. And so the Passover is really the centerpiece of the Jewish family meal during this time. And the lamb would be slain the day before the Passover. It would be eaten that evening. And then just as Jesus and the disciples celebrate Passover as a family, they do so along with all other Jews on the same day. And so Passover again is a celebration of what Yahweh, the Lord, has done to rescue his people. It's also looking not just backwards, it's looking forwards in anticipation for what God will do in the future to rescue his people. So backwards, looking at how he redeemed them from the hands of Pharaoh, looking forward to how God will rescue his people as well. And so typically during Passover, Jews would eat at tables, but not at Passover, or at other more festive meals. That instead of eating at tables, they would recline on the floor with pillows. And you see that actually mentioned explicitly in some of the scriptural texts. And the reason why is because during the Exodus, they didn't have tables to sit at. That when God set them free from Egypt, they were going out into the wilderness, and all they had to lay down on was the desert ground beneath them, and they would eat. And so lying down, though, was an expression of freedom. It was an expression, it was to show that the restrictions were gone. And so the disciples are reclining on the floor with Jesus during this meal, and there's pillows around them. And they're looking forward also to the day where Yahweh, the Lord, will grant freedom to his people. So it's looking back to the book of Exodus, is looking forward to another Exodus that is to come. And so Jesus is saying, hey, listen, guys, this is actually about me. And he takes all of the elements of the Passover supper and he begins to divvy them up and point and use them and teach how all of it actually points to him. And so there in this moment, Jesus is saying that there's a new covenant that God is going to inaugurate, that God is going to begin, a new way that God will relate to his people, and it'll be through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so if we're thinking about it through a biblical perspective, this was the last Passover meal in human history. That the Last Supper of Jesus and the disciples together before he goes to the cross is the last Passover meal in human history, because the Passover is fulfilled in him. There is no more Passover. Jesus died and rose again. He was the thing the Passover is pointing to. And so it's the last supper before he goes to the cross, and it again, it's significant that it would be Passover. And even today, Jews say they celebrate Passover, but the true Messiah has come. The true Savior has come, and it's been fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the deliverer. He is the rescuer. He is the one the world has been waiting for. And so again, at this last meal, he reinterprets all of this stuff to say, hey, listen, all of the Old Testament, all of the rituals, all of the offerings, everything that we have been doing as the Jewish people, all of it has been to build up and to point to and prepare you for the Messiah, Jesus. And so that's what the meal was always about. And so when we take the Lord's Supper together, that's what we're doing, is we're reminding ourselves of the salvation that God's provided for us in his Son. The Passover is pointing forward to it. And in our case as Christians, when we take the Lord's Supper, we're pointing back to the death of Jesus on our behalf. And so then Jesus washed the disciples' feet. He washes their feet as an act of sacrificial service. Again, reminding the disciples, hey, I've come to serve you. I've come to make you clean. And so he's showing his love for his people. After which, Jesus teaches the disciples a lot of things. He teaches them about what it looks like to abide in him, to grow, to experience joy, to walk walk and persevere in times of suffering. He talks about the Holy Spirit as well. In that, he follows all of his teachings in chapters 14, 15, and 16 of John, for example. In verse 17, or chapter 17 of John, he prays for himself, prays for the disciples, and he prays for us, all the followers who would be to come. And then they conclude this time together at Passover by singing a hymn, and they're probably singing the Hallel songs or psalms, and they do that probably from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118 before they head out to the Mount of Olives. And so as they head out and go across the Mount of Olives, they're singing. They go down into the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus brings specifically the disciples, but minus Judas because he's gone. But he brings Peter, James, and John with him to the inner part of the garden where he is praying in the garden. And Jesus is already aware of the disciples' weaknesses. And he's already told Peter, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times when the time comes. And so while Jesus prays, the disciples fall asleep. Again, no surprise to Jesus. Well, in the garden, as Jesus is praying, Father, if it be your will, please take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done. He prays it 3 times, sweat like drops of blood, the pressure, the immense weight, the enormity of the sacrifice he's going to be making, bearing the wrath for sin on the cross. I mean, he's doing this, and as the disciples are praying, and then they're falling asleep, and as Jesus is praying, Judas appears with some soldiers in the distance, and he says, I'm going to give you a sign, and I'm going to kiss the person you need to arrest. I'm going to kiss him on the cheek. Judas walks up to Jesus, and Jesus looks at him, and Jesus says, friend. I love that he calls him friend. At the moment of betrayal, he says, friend, do what you've come to do. Judas leans in, and he kisses Jesus on the cheek to identify him as the one to arrest. And the soldiers move in. Peter jumps up and he pulls out a sword. And because he promised Jesus he would defend Jesus and he would be willing to die with Christ. And he pulls out his sword and he cuts a soldier's ear off. And then Jesus rebukes Peter and says, Peter, put up the sword. If you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. And then he takes up that soldier's ear and he puts it back onto his head, Malchus's ear, back onto his head. And he heals it right there in front of all the people who are going to betray him and arrest him. So when Jesus is arrested late on Thursday night, a series of judicial proceedings take place into the early hours of Friday morning. And during that nighttime gathering, there were the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high authority, and they were all there, and they were interviewing Jesus, and they were trying to formulate an official charge against him, even though in their minds were already made up. They knew he was going to be guilty no matter what happened. And the thing about this trial that happens late Thursday into Friday morning is that it technically, legally speaking, is an unofficial trial, because Jewish law has forbidden trials be held at night. Because they didn't seem like they would be trials of integrity. And so this whole situation's already immoral from a moral standpoint, because Jesus is innocent, of course. But it's also illegal because the way the trial's going down. And during this whole scene, Jesus is considered to have blasphemed against God. Because he's claiming to be the Son of God, he's claiming to forgive sins, which is all that the religious leaders needed to proceed with punishing Jesus. However, much maybe to the surprise of some people, 3 years before Good Friday, before the first ever Good Friday, the Roman government, Pontius Pilate, had taken away the Jewish leaders' ability to execute anyone due to a decree passed down from Rome. So 3 years prior to this moment, really maybe about at the start of Jesus' ministry, that the Roman government passed a law that if you wanted to punish or you wanted to execute someone, you had to go through the Roman government first. And so that is why Pilate and the Romans could alone only carry out capital punishment. Previously, the Sanhedrin would not have bothered the Romans or bothered Pilate with this case, but because of this new law, Pilate has to hear the case against Jesus. So, extremely early on Friday morning, they will be taking Jesus to see Pontius Pilate. And that's when the official verdict is given. That's when it'll be decided, guilty or not guilty. So Thursday of Holy Week is one of the busier days. And as we draw closer to Friday, it reminds us that Jesus has come to make good on God's promises of salvation and redemption. A salvation that comes through the breaking of Jesus' body and the shedding of his blood at the cross. And so let me invite you. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. here at Freedom Fellowship in White Pine, we will be having our Good Friday service. It'll be a much different tone and style of service than what we do throughout the year. It's the only one like it where it's very somber, and we do that because of the significance, the weight, the meaning of Jesus' crucifixion on the cross. And so tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. here, it'll be live streamed as well on Facebook and YouTube. But we are going to be taking a more in-depth look at the cross. What does it mean? What does it accomplish? What did Jesus experience on the cross as he goes there after the verdict of guilty has been given to Jesus? So I want to encourage you to join us in person. You can join us online, but make plans to celebrate and remember the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And here in person, we'll be taking the Lord's Supper together in communion as well to remember his life given in place of our lives. So I hope that you're continuing to have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening at our Good Friday service. Thank you, and God bless.